The racist, corrupt cops laughed at the black man in court, not with the restrained chuckle of someone hiding disdain, but with loud, exaggerated, mocking laughter, the kind meant to humiliate someone publicly, to strip them of dignity. The courtroom echoed with it. No one stopped them. Not the judge. Not the bailiffs. Not the attorneys. The laughter spilled over into cruel whispers, shared glances, and scoffs as the black man stood silently at the stand, not saying a word in return. He didn't flinch, but something inside him cracked, not in defeat, but in fire. And still, they kept going. "Man, what you even doing here?" one of them said loud enough for the room to hear, grinning. "You think standing there in that cheap-ass suit makes you important? Please. You're just another thug playing lawyer." Another leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, grinning like a man who believed he was untouchable. "I give it 2 months before he's back on the other side of this bench, locked up, probably. Maybe he'll even ask us for a deal next time. That's if he makes it that far." It wasn't the first time they'd humiliated someone like this. But it was the first time they didn't realize who they were talking to. Not yet. This wasn't just a courtroom appearance. This was personal. It was supposed to be a routine hearing, just another day where cops played their power games and walked away without consequence. The black man had come to court as a witness, offering testimony in a case where those very officers were being scrutinized for misconduct. He knew the system. He'd studied it, lived it, and survived it. But that day, they didn't see any of that. They didn't care. To them, he was just another black man who didn't belong in the room unless he was in handcuffs. What they didn't know, what they could have never imagined, is that the room already belonged to him. They mocked the way he walked into the courtroom, too calm for their liking. They rolled their eyes at his briefcase, whispered about his past, as if his success was a fluke. They questioned why someone like him was even speaking in a legal proceeding. "Is he even certified?" one of them said with a snort. The same cop who, months earlier, had pulled him over for a broken taillight, only to throw him against a hood and cuff him in front of his son, all because he fit a description. What happened that day in court was just the latest drop in a bucket that had been filling for years. But they didn't know that. They didn't know that this man, silent, composed, humiliated in front of the judge, the audience, the cameras, had been building something. Planning something. Watching, recording, documenting. Not for revenge, but for justice. For transformation. They thought they were watching him fall apart. They had no idea they were standing in the final scene of their own downfall. The case at hand was a simple one, at least on paper: community misconduct allegations, testimonies of abuse, discrimination, and corruption. But the mood in the courtroom said otherwise. This was more than paperwork. This was deeper than legal arguments. This was centuries of pain, decades of silence, years of injustice, packed into a single proceeding that was about to change everything. Only one person in that room knew the full truth of what was about to happen. And the most bitter irony? The same cops who laughed the loudest had no idea that this wasn't a hearing, it was a reveal. A reckoning. The reason he'd been quiet wasn't fear. It was precision. The kind of silence that holds back a tidal wave until the exact right moment to crash. Because when he finally opened his mouth, when he finally addressed the court, not as a witness, not as a victim, but as something far more powerful, the entire room stopped breathing. But before that moment, came the gut punch, the humiliation. He stood there, being dissected by their mockery, their grins, their muttered jokes. Every breath he took felt like inhaling fire, holding back every instinct to lash out, to scream, to fight. But he didn't. Because he knew. He knew something they didn't. Something that had the power to end careers, shatter illusions, and flip the entire narrative upside down. He remembered the night that led to this trial. He remembered the kid, his nephew, slammed on the hood of a car for nothing. He remembered the bruises. The blood. The silence. The lie in the report that blamed everything on non-compliance. He remembered going to internal affairs and getting stonewalled. He remembered being told, "You're wasting your time, man. These cops run the city." And he remembered the look on his nephew's face, asking, "Uncle, will they ever pay for what they did?" That was the moment the real story began. The courtroom was just the stage. The humiliation, that was the opening act. The judge, half interested, banged the gavel to silence the laughter. But it was too late. The damage was done. The court reporter's fingers stopped typing. The room was heavy. The moment was unforgettable. The man at the center of it all didn't speak. Not yet. But the silence itself said everything. A silence so controlled, it scared the few who were paying attention. Some in the audience shook their heads. Others looked down, embarrassed by what they were witnessing. But the cops? They leaned into it. One of them whispered, "You'll never outrank us. You were born beneath this system, and that's where you'll stay." He turned his head slightly. Just enough to meet the officer's eyes. And he smiled. Not because he was okay. Not because it didn't hurt. But because the countdown had already started. They just didn't know what was coming. They thought they were mocking a man beneath them. What they didn't realize, what they never imagined, was that the very system they thought they controlled had already chosen its new leader. And the man they tried to humiliate? He was about to become their boss. But the real question is, what did he do next? And how did he turn their laughter into silence, and then, into fear? Stick around, because what he revealed next, made every single one of them regret ever opening their mouths. And trust me, you don't want to miss what he did to them in the end. Before we begin, we want to speak directly to every black viewer watching this. Here at Plow of Twist, we stand firmly against all forms of racism and injustice. We believe in stories that reflect the truth, the struggle, and the triumph of those who are too often silenced. If you've ever felt overlooked, mistreated, or stereotyped, this story is for you. You matter. Your voice matters. And your story deserves to be told. Now sit back, because what you're about to hear might just flip the system. Don't forget to subscribe to Plow of Twist for more powerful stories. Wishing you a meaningful and unforgettable experience. Enjoy the story. His name was Darnell Whitaker, and from the outside, he looked like any other black man trying to make something of himself in a city that wasn't made for him. Oakland had sharp corners, beautiful in some blocks, brutal in others. Darnell grew up on the kind of street where opportunity had to be fought for, begged for, or stolen. He never had the luxury of waiting for things to come to him. The neighborhood raised him with its rough love, neighbors who kept their doors cracked in the summer, men on stoops who warned kids about bad choices with the weight of their own regrets in their eyes, women who scraped up dinners from nothing and still made them feel like Sunday meals. His mother, a nurse who worked double shifts, used to whisper into his ear when he was little, "You are not what they think you are, baby. You are what you choose to become." Darnell carried those words like armor. By the time he was 17, he had seen more patrol cars than playgrounds. He watched friends get swallowed up by the system, not always because they were guilty, but because they were easy targets. Some ran, some got locked away, and some just stopped fighting altogether. But not him. He had this quiet, focused fire in him. The kind that didn't scream, but studied. The kind that remembered names, dates, details. While the other boys were running corners, Darnell was reading law books he'd found at the old community center downtown. They didn't understand why he spent afternoons inside while life happened outside. But he did. He understood. He saw the pattern early. He knew how the game was rigged. He didn't want to beat the system from the outside. He wanted to learn it from the inside, and eventually, dismantle it from the top. It wasn't easy. Nothing ever was. He got into Howard on a scholarship, not because someone opened a door, but because he kicked it in. While other students debated legal theory, Darnell already knew what it felt like to be thrown against a wall by a cop who never asked questions. His lens was different. Every class felt personal. Every case study reminded him of someone he knew. He wasn't chasing a degree, he was chasing change. After law school, he could have gone corporate. He had offers. He had suits that finally fit and a voice that people listened to when he stood up in court. But he turned down the six-figure jobs to come back home. Back to Oakland. He opened a small legal aid office near the same corner store where he used to buy his mom flowers with leftover lunch money. He didn't want to save the world, he wanted to save his block. And that's when things started to shift. The local precinct had a reputation. The names changed, but the culture didn't. Officers like Beck, Salinger, and McKnight had a way of handling things that always leaned more toward fear than justice. The people knew their faces, but not for the right reasons. There were whispers, of beatings that didn't get filed, of stops that never ended in tickets but always in trauma. These men didn't just wear badges, they wore arrogance like cologne. And they didn't like Darnell from the moment he started showing up in courtrooms defending the kids they used to bully into guilty pleas. Beck, the ringleader of sorts, was the type who smiled with his teeth but never with his eyes. He walked into rooms like he owned them, and when he laughed, it wasn't from joy, it was from power. Salinger was slicker, quieter, but just as dangerous. He played the game better, but he played dirty. And McKnight? He was the muscle. Never needed to speak much because his fists did the talking. Together, they moved like shadows through the community, not protectors, but predators in uniform. Darnell crossed them too many times. Beat them in court. Exposed sloppy paperwork. Raised questions that no one else dared to ask. He became a thorn in their side. And in a city that still carried old habits, a black man who got too loud, even with a degree, was always a threat. Then came the night that changed everything. Darnell's nephew, Jamari, had just turned 17. Bright kid. Talented with numbers. Dreamed of being an engineer. One night, he was walking home with a backpack and a hoodie, nothing more. That was enough. Beck's unit stopped him 2 blocks from his house. Said he looked suspicious. Said they had reports of a break-in, even though no such report existed. They didn't know he was Darnell's nephew. They didn't care. What happened next was violence, justified later with lies. Jamari ended up in the hospital. Bruised. Bloodied. Traumatized. Darnell showed up at the precinct the next morning demanding answers. Instead, he got stonewalled. The reports had already been filed, falsified, twisted, clean. No witnesses. No footage. Just reasonable suspicion and non-compliance. He tried internal affairs. Dead end. He tried the mayor's office. No response. Even allies were afraid to get involved. Beck and his crew were too connected, too protected. But Darnell wasn't the same kid from the block anymore. He had learned how to fight differently. He began building a case. Quietly. Carefully. Interviewing others. Recording stories. Gathering statements. He spent months connecting the dots, piecing together years of abuse into something undeniable. His office turned into a war room. He worked nights. Missed meals. Lost sleep. But he didn't stop. That's when the city announced the upcoming oversight hearing on police misconduct. It was supposed to be symbolic, a gesture to calm rising tensions. But Darnell saw it as his opening. He submitted testimony. Requested to speak. And they granted it. Probably thought it wouldn't matter. Probably thought no one would listen. The day of the hearing, Darnell walked into that courtroom with every document, every file, every piece of truth he had collected. He wore a black suit. Simple. Clean. Nothing flashy. He didn't need theatrics, he had facts. But what he didn't expect, what no one could have predicted, was how those officers would react when they saw him enter. They were already seated, whispering among themselves. Beck caught sight of Darnell and smirked like a man who had already won. Salinger leaned over and said something that made McKnight chuckle. They didn't see him as a threat. Not even close. To them, he was a joke. And the second he stood to speak, the laughter started. It wasn't a misunderstanding. It was deliberate. Loud. Mean. It was a message, you don't belong here. Darnell stood, holding his ground, while the courtroom watched him get stripped of his dignity in real time. The judge did nothing. The officials looked away. It felt like every step he had taken, every late night studying, every case he had won, had just been wiped away by a single moment of public humiliation. That moment was bigger than a personal attack. It was about what they thought of people like him. What they still thought. And yet, he didn't walk out. He didn't yell. He didn't let their mockery define the moment. He simply stared forward, calm, composed, and unbothered on the surface. Because deep inside, something was rising. They thought they were watching him crumble. But what they were actually witnessing, even if they didn't know it yet, was the rise of the man who would soon control their futures. Because Darnell wasn't just a lawyer anymore. He had been appointed to a new position. One that would make every single one of them answer for everything they'd done. And they were about to find out. But not yet. Not just yet. The days following the courtroom incident moved like fog, thick and difficult to navigate, yet somehow electrified with anticipation. Darnell could feel something shifting, something he had been preparing for even before he had the words to name it. He hadn't come that far to break now, not after everything he had carried to get to this point. But that didn't make the weight any lighter. Every breath felt like resistance. Every step toward that precinct, toward those men, toward that title, felt like walking into the fire he had been gathering wood for his whole life. The difference now was, he had the flame. Oakland was still breathing through its cracks. Headlines buzzed about the public hearing, but nothing concrete had happened yet. Beck and his crew walked the streets like nothing had touched them. Their laughter in court had burned into Darnell's memory like acid, but they weren't done. A few days later, graffiti showed up on his office door, fraud, in red spray paint. He didn't call the cops. Why would he? The ones responsible probably wore badges. Inside his office, the atmosphere was tense. His assistant, Naisha, looked up from her desk as he entered, her eyes filled with the kind of concern that wasn't just professional. She cared. "You sure you want to go through with this?" she asked, even though she already knew the answer. Darnell gave her a nod that carried the weight of 1,000 unspoken reasons. "It's already started. Can't walk away now." She sighed, leaning back. "They're gonna come for you harder this time. You've already humiliated them just by standing there." He sat down across from her, hands clasped tightly, his voice quiet but certain. That wasn't humiliation. That was warning. What's coming next, that's the part they won't forget. That night, Darnell drove across the city, to the office of the deputy mayor, a man named Cruz who had once interned under Darnell back when he taught evening classes at a local community college. Cruz had moved fast in politics, but he never forgot where he came from, or who helped him get there. Inside the dimly lit office, they spoke in hushed tones, not because they were scared, but because the walls in that building had ears. "You sure you want this appointment to be public now?" Cruz asked. "We can ease into it. Let the press warm up first. Make it more palatable." Darnell shook his head. "They need to know. The people who laughed at me, they need to see me walk into that department front door with every camera pointed at my back. Not out of pride. Out of principle." Cruz hesitated. "There's gonna be backlash. And it won't be subtle. You know that, right? Those men, they've been protected for a reason. Darnell leaned forward, his voice a low force of nature. Then let them protect each other. But they're not gonna stop me. Not this time. The next morning, the city made the announcement. Darnell Whitaker, former public defender, civil rights advocate, and lifelong Oakland resident, would be sworn in as the interim chief of internal police oversight. The press scrambled for context. Pundits either praised the bold move or called it political theater. But inside the department, it wasn't confusion. It was fear. And Beck? He pretended to laugh when he heard the news, but behind his smirk was a tremor. Salinger threw a chair in the precinct's locker room. McKnight just stood in silence, fists clenched, nostrils flaring like a man seconds away from eruption. 3 days later, Darnell walked through the department doors in a dark gray suit, no tie, no entourage. Just purpose. The same officers who had mocked him days earlier now watched him walk past with unreadable faces. Some nodded. Some looked away. Some stared him down. But none of them spoke. Not this time. His first meeting as chief wasn't in a boardroom. It was in the roll call hall. He stood at the front while the officers filled the seats, row after row of uniforms, tension so thick it vibrated in the air. Darnell didn't speak with anger. He didn't raise his voice. He simply laid down facts. This department is under review. Every case. Every complaint. Every sealed file. The past is no longer off limits. One officer scoffed quietly. Darnell looked directly at him. You will be held accountable. Not because I want revenge. But because this city deserves better. Because people in this building have confused a badge for a crown. That ends now. Later, in private meetings, the resistance began. Salinger requested reassignment. Beck tried to play the charm card, cornering Darnell in the hallway. You know this isn't personal, right? Beck said, his voice slick with false warmth. That day in court. Just boys being boys. You know how it is. Tension. Pressure. We didn't mean anything by it. Darnell didn't blink. You meant every word. And you're gonna answer for it. Beck's eyes narrowed. You really think you can clean this place up? You're one man, Whitaker. Darnell didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. I'm not alone. I've got the people behind me. I've got the truth. And I've got the one thing you can't fake, integrity. The days turned into weeks. Files were reopened. Anonymous tips began to pour in. Darnell formed a task force, diverse, determined, unafraid. Nayshaw was promoted to chief investigator. Community leaders were invited into strategy sessions. A new culture was being born, and it wasn't subtle. But with change came pressure. His car was keyed outside City Hall. He received anonymous letters telling him to back off, or else. And then came the leak. A confidential file from Darnell's past, a sealed juvenile incident from when he was 16, sent to a local reporter anonymously. The article painted him as a hypocrite. The internet lit up. Some called for his resignation. Nayshaw burst into his office, the paper in her hand. They're playing dirty, D. You want me to go public? Shut this down. He looked at the headline, then back at her. No. Let them come. Let them dig. I'm not hiding. Not from them. Not from the truth. The backlash grew louder. City council members began to waver. The mayor called for a review of the leadership transition. Cruz warned him that there might be a vote to suspend his position. That night, Darnell sat alone in his office, lights off, files open in front of him. The city outside pulsed with life, unaware of how close everything was to collapse. He ran his hand over the old photo of Jamari taped to his desk. That one smile, before everything changed. His voice echoed in Darnell's memory, Uncle, will they ever pay for what they did? Darnell whispered to the empty room, they will. I swear. The next morning, he walked into the city council meeting. Cameras were everywhere. Journalists waited like wolves. Inside, the tension was so thick it pressed against the walls. One by one, members raised concerns. Asked questions. Challenged his integrity. And then came the voice from the back. Someone stood up, shaking slightly, her voice strong despite the tremble. My name is Sandra Reyes. My brother died in police custody last year. They said it was heart failure. But I saw the bruises. I saw the fear in his eyes days before it happened. Mr. Whitaker is the only one who listened to me. The only one who gave me a voice. And I'm telling you now, we need him. We can't lose him too. The room fell silent. More stood up. One by one. Community members. Teachers. Business owners. Former clients. Mothers. Each one telling their story. Not just about Darnell, but about the system. And how he was the only one brave enough to face it head-on. The vote didn't go through. He stayed. But something had shifted again. Because someone, from inside the department, had just sent him a flash drive. No name. No note. Just a folder labeled, "Watch this." And when he opened it, what he saw on that screen changed everything. Everything. And if what was on that footage was real, then what he was about to do next would shock the entire city. Especially the men who thought their secrets would never see the light of day. The room was dim, lit only by the low hum of the computer screen. Darnell sat motionless, eyes fixed on the grainy footage playing in front of him. It wasn't the poor quality that made his breath hitch, it was what he was watching unfold. The flash drive had no label, no hint of its sender, but what it contained was damning. Surveillance video from a body cam, time-stamped almost 2 years prior, clearly marked as archived. But this wasn't archived. This was buried. And for good reason. The camera caught Beck, Salinger, and McKnight outside a corner store in East Oakland, in the dead of night, confronting a young man matching no description. The boy was unarmed, visibly terrified, hands raised before they even approached. They shoved him against the wall, cursed, laughed, then cuffed him before the situation escalated. The footage cut before the worst happened, but it was enough. Enough to prove what they'd always denied. Enough to spark an investigation that could reach far beyond the three of them. Darnell leaned back slowly, the weight of what he'd just seen sinking deep into his bones. His phone buzzed on the desk, a message from Naisha, "You saw it?" He didn't reply. There was nothing left to say. It was time. The next day, he requested an emergency tribunal hearing. Not in secret. Not quietly. He sent the request through every channel he could, CCing the mayor's office, internal affairs, the DA's office, and the press. He made sure there was no way to ignore it, no corner dark enough for them to hide in. The hearing was scheduled within 48 hours, and the city buzzed with speculation. That morning, the courthouse was packed. People lined the sidewalk. News vans clustered at the edge of the street. Inside, the mood was electric and tense. Everyone felt it, though they didn't yet know what they were about to witness. Darnell entered the courtroom with steady steps, wearing the same black suit from his first day, pressed, deliberate. Naisha followed close behind, carrying a thick file. When he passed Beck, who sat at the defense table with Salinger and McKnight, the air between them felt like it could ignite. Beck offered a smirk, but it lacked the confidence of before. It was forced. Nervous. He knew something was coming. He just didn't know what. When the judge signaled the session start, Darnell stood, nodded respectfully, and walked to the center of the room. He didn't carry notes. He didn't need them. What he carried was memory. Fire. Justice. I wasn't planning to speak today, he began, voice calm, heavy with meaning. But I received new information that changes everything. Information that demands to be heard, not tomorrow, not later, right now. There was a shuffle in the courtroom. Beck shifted in his seat. Salinger's eyes flicked toward the exit. McKnight clenched his jaw. Darnell gestured to Nasha, who walked over to the clerk and handed them the flash drive. The screen on the courtroom wall came to life, and the footage began to play. The silence was immediate. No one moved. No one breathed. The room was held hostage by the truth. There was no mistaking the voices, the uniforms, the brutality. Darnell let the footage speak for itself. When it ended, he waited. Then, he turned back toward the officers. "You laughed at me," he said, his voice never rising. "You mocked me, not just in this courtroom, but in every space you thought I didn't belong. You've silenced people like me for decades with your reports, your connections, your lies. But this is your truth. And it's here now. For everyone to see." The judge's gavel struck the bench once, but it barely registered. The air was too thick with revelation. Beck stood suddenly, his voice defensive, cracking. "That's out of context. You don't know the full story." Darnell turned to him, unwavering. "Then explain it. Tell the city what part of that tape shows you protecting and serving." Salinger leaned forward, whispering urgently to his attorney, who looked like he'd aged 10 years in 2 minutes. McKnight remained seated, eyes narrowed, fists still clenched, but something in his posture had shifted, less defiance, more recognition. The tide had turned, and they all felt it. The judge called for a brief recess, but Darnell knew it wasn't to deliberate, it was to prepare for fallout. What came next was inevitable. The DA's office requested immediate suspension of all 3 officers, pending formal charges. Internal Affairs issued statements within hours. But the most powerful moment came not from the officials, but from the people. As Darnell stepped outside the courtroom, he was met with a wall of faces, neighbors, families, activists, strangers. They weren't cheering. They weren't clapping. They were watching him with the kind of quiet awe that only comes from witnessing something they thought they'd never see. A black man who didn't just survive the system, but turned it inside out, from within. Later that night, back at his office, Darnell finally allowed himself a moment to exhale. Nasha sat across from him, the energy still buzzing in the walls. "You just shook this whole city," she said softly. He looked down at the picture of Jamari on his desk, his voice almost a whisper. "I didn't do it for that. I did it so nobody else has to go through what he did." There was a knock at the door. Cruz stepped in, carrying a folder. "I figured you'd want this," he said. "It's the formal paperwork. Permanent position. Chief of Oversight. No more interim." Darnell took the folder but didn't open it. He just nodded. "They're gonna come harder now. The ones who still think this city belongs to them." Cruz shrugged. "Let them try. You've got the chair now. And the truth." But it wasn't over. Not completely. Because inside the same envelope was something else. A letter. No signature. Just one line. "You don't know half of what they've done." Darnell stared at it, his mind racing. Because if that tape was just the beginning, what came next could be even darker. And he was going to find it. Every last piece. The silence in Darnell's office was unlike any other he had felt. It wasn't peace. It wasn't satisfaction. It was anticipation, cold and calculating. That letter sat on his desk like a loaded weapon, its weight heavier than any verdict, any title, any praise he had earned in the last 24 hours. "You don't know half of what they've done." He read it over and over again, every word etched into his mind. Someone had sent it from inside the system, that much was clear. And whoever it was, they knew things that could fracture the very foundation of what Darnell had just shaken. He leaned forward, elbows on the desk, pressing his palms against his face, trying to breathe through the flood of questions now crashing against his thoughts. What else were they hiding? How deep did this really go? Naisha stepped back into the room, holding 2 coffees. She froze when she saw him, posture tense, eyes sharp. "That letter still messing with you?" she asked, setting the cup beside him. He nodded slowly, staring ahead. She didn't need more explanation. The weight in the air was already enough. "You think it's real?" she finally said, her voice lower. He turned to her, eyes heavy. "I think the truth's bigger than we expected. And we haven't even started digging." The next morning, Darnell called a closed-door meeting with a small group from his task force. People he trusted, not just professionals, but people with a fire for justice. Naisha sat at his right. Across the table were 2 former officers turned whistleblowers, and a digital analyst named Malik who had helped Darnell compile the bodycam footage evidence. He held up a flash drive. "That file didn't just come with a video," Malik said, plugging it into his laptop. "There's metadata, hidden files, timestamps, some encrypted logs. It's like a trail, someone wanted you to find this, but only if you were ready to see it all." On the screen appeared folders named by code: Ops Alpha, Restraint Index, Case D-147, Redline, Witness Null. Naisha leaned in, frowning. "That's police internal language. That's not just case stuff. That's surveillance." Malik nodded. "Exactly. These aren't reports. These are operations." Darnell's chest tightened. He had seen enough manipulation in the system to know when something was covered. But this was systematic concealment. Premeditated. Coordinated. He clicked on one folder. Inside, images, timestamps, GPS logs. Darnell's name. His nephew's name. Court dates. Meetings. Phone transcripts. Conversations with clients. He jerked back from the screen, his hands curling into fists. "They've been watching me for years." Malik nodded grimly. "And not just you. Others. Journalists. Activists. Even judges." Darnell's voice came out low, simmering with fury. "They built a shadow file on everyone who stood in their way." Naisha looked at him, eyes burning. "And now we've got the proof." The rest of the day was a blur of hushed phone calls and heavy decisions. Darnell reached out to the Attorney General's office, requesting a federal oversight probe. He scheduled a press conference, determined to let the public know, but also aware of the risk. He knew this wasn't going to end with policy changes or reassignments. Not now. This had crossed into the territory of crimes, deep, buried crimes with years of damage attached to them. That night, Darnell sat alone in his apartment, TV off, lights dim, the city outside glowing like distant stars in a black sea. The echo of Beck's laughter still haunted him. But what shook him now wasn't that they'd tried to break him, it was how close they'd come to succeeding without him ever knowing. And yet, something inside him felt clearer than ever. This wasn't about revenge. It was about pulling up every rotten root, exposing the disease, and letting the world see it for what it was. The press conference was scheduled for the next morning. But hours before, something happened that made the ground shift again. Darnell received a call, blocked number. He picked up, expecting static or threats. Instead, a voice came through, hoarse and trembling. "You don't know me," the man said, "but I was there. I was there when they did it. When they covered it up. That kid, he didn't die from heart failure. They beat him. They left him in the car for over an hour in the heat. He begged for help. And they laughed." Darnell's spine went rigid. He didn't interrupt. The voice kept talking. "They changed the report. Said he resisted. Said the heat didn't matter. They made me sign it. I've been living with it ever since. But when I saw you at that hearing, when I saw the tape, I knew I had to tell someone. I'll come forward. I'll testify. Darnell's heart pounded. What's your name? There was a pause. You'll get it in the envelope I just left outside your building. It's got my statement. And more tapes. I couldn't carry it anymore. When he opened the envelope 10 minutes later, he found the name of an active officer. A confession. And 3 more flash drives. The man had risked everything. And now, Darnell had enough to break the dam completely. At the press conference, the room was tense. Journalists, city officials, law enforcement, citizens, they all stared at him as he took the podium. His voice didn't tremble. It rang out, calm and controlled, with the force of every injustice behind it. He told them about the surveillance. The coordinated cover-ups. The recordings. The deaths. The lies. Then he named the officers. One by one. Including Beck. Salinger. McKnight. They laughed when they thought I was weak. They laughed because they didn't believe someone like me could stand here. But the truth doesn't care about their laughter. It outlives it. When the conference ended, the room erupted, reporters shouting, citizens cheering, officers storming out. Beck wasn't among them. He'd gone quiet. Missing. Hours later, Darnell received word that Beck had resigned. Disappeared before the warrant could be served. But it didn't matter. What he left behind would catch up to him. The walls were closing in on all of them now. That night, standing on his apartment balcony, Darnell finally let the moment settle in. The air was heavy, yes, but it didn't suffocate him anymore. It felt charged with possibility, like thunder just before the downpour. Inside, his phone buzzed again. Another message. Anonymous sender. One sentence. This city isn't clean yet. Darnell stared at the screen for a long time. He knew the fight wasn't over. But for the first time, it felt like they were finally playing on his terms. The days that followed the press conference moved like thunderclouds across a dry sky, heavy, volatile, and carrying the weight of something about to break open even further. The city was no longer just watching Darnell, it was breathing with him. His name was on every news anchor's tongue, his face on every screen, but this time, not as a target or a defendant or a protester. He was the man who cracked open something people had whispered about for years and pulled it into the light. But the spotlight didn't feel like victory. It felt like exposure. Vulnerability. Because with the truth now out there, the backlash came fast, and not just from the obvious enemies. Politicians who had once praised him now hesitated to speak. Sponsors and donors pulled funding from civic programs, blaming instability. Even allies looked at him differently, not out of mistrust, but out of fear. Darnell understood why. What he'd done didn't just burn down a corrupt group of officers. It shattered a structure that many had quietly learned to survive within. Now, they didn't know what would replace it. Inside the precinct, a purge had begun. Officers named in the evidence were placed on administrative leave. Some denied involvement. Others lawyered up. A few resigned without explanation, leaving behind desks full of unfiled complaints and buried reports. McKnight was arrested after further footage tied him to an undocumented assault from 3 years earlier. Salinger refused to speak to anyone, locking himself in his home as reporters circled like vultures. But it was Beck's disappearance that cast the longest shadow. He hadn't been seen since the day of the conference. No trace. No statement. Just silence, and the growing fear that he wasn't gone, just planning his next move. At City Hall, the mayor called for calm, urging residents not to lose trust in the justice system. But his words rang hollow, especially after leaked emails showed that he'd been briefed on misconduct years prior and done nothing. Protests reignited. Not violent, but louder. More organized. More relentless. The people weren't just asking for reform, they were demanding transformation. And in the center of it all stood Darnell, steady but burning on the inside, carrying more than most men could hold without falling. One evening, Nayshaw burst into his office, laptop open, voice urgent. "You need to see this," she said, breath tight. On the screen, another video played, but this one wasn't from police records. It was footage from a security camera inside a city warehouse used for storing old evidence. It showed a man, clearly Beck, entering late at night, using an outdated keycard. He carried a bag and walked straight toward the back room. The timestamp was from 48 hours after the press conference. "He's not running," Nayshaw said. "He's collecting something." Darnell stared at the grainy image, jaw tense. "He's trying to cover his tracks." Later that night, a fire broke out in that same warehouse. By the time the firefighters arrived, most of the interior was ash. No injuries. No suspects. But everyone knew it wasn't random. Darnell felt the sting of it like a slap across the face. Dozens of cases. Hundreds of files. Gone. The irony was cruel, the same man who once laughed at the destruction of lives was now burning evidence of his own. And still, no one could find him. The weight of everything began to seep into Darnell's bones. He barely slept. His voice had grown hoarser. He spent long nights combing through what remained, sitting in silence as Nayshaw and Malik tried to piece together digital records lost in the fire. But despite the pressure, something in him remained unbroken. Because for the first time, victims who had once accepted silence began to speak. A mother came forward, sharing a recording of a threatening phone call from an unnamed officer after her son filed a complaint. A retired dispatcher revealed that certain calls were systematically delayed or rerouted when they came from specific neighborhoods. The floodgates were open now, and even if Beck tried to erase the past, it was too late. The ghosts were speaking. But with every new voice, Darnell felt another knot twist in his chest. Because now came the hardest part, not exposing the truth, but deciding what to do with it. He wasn't a prosecutor. He wasn't a judge. He was one man with a title, a team, and a city spiraling between hope and fear. People wanted justice, yes, but they also wanted closure, healing, direction. And Darnell was no longer sure how to give it to them. Every move now had consequences, and not just legal ones. A wrong step could cost innocent officers their careers. A right one might destroy public trust even more. And through it all, the people kept asking the same thing: how far would he go? How much vengeance was justice? One evening, Cruz stopped by his office unannounced, carrying a bottle of whiskey and 2 glasses. He poured without asking, then leaned against the edge of the desk. "You ever think about walking away?" he asked quietly. Darnell didn't answer. Cruz sipped, then continued. "They're scared of you now. Not because you're wrong, but because you're right. You've seen too much. And they know if you keep pulling, the whole system might come down." Darnell met his eyes. "So I stop pulling?" Cruz shrugged. "I'm saying, maybe ask yourself what you're trying to build once it's gone." That night, Darnell walked through the neighborhood he grew up in. It looked different now, new buildings, gentrified storefronts, but still carried that same rhythm. On a corner, a young boy kicked a ball against a wall, laughing with a friend. Darnell stopped, watched for a moment. That boy had no idea what had been done in his name, to protect his future. And yet, that's exactly why it mattered. Because the fight wasn't about punishment anymore. It was about preservation. Back at his apartment, another letter waited at his door. This one hand-delivered. Inside, a single line, written in sharp black ink: "Meet me where it started." No signature. No address. Just that. He knew exactly what it meant. The corner where Jamari was assaulted. The corner that started everything. Darnell didn't tell Nayshaw. He didn't alert the press. He drove there alone, just past midnight. The street was quiet. Dimly lit. Empty, until he saw the figure leaning against the same brick wall, hands in pockets, head bowed. Beck. He looked older. Hollow. Not the smug man from court, not the predator from the footage. Just a man who looked like he was sinking. Darnell stepped forward slowly, keeping distance. Beck didn't move. "I figured you'd come," Beck said without turning. "Wasn't sure you'd come alone, though." Darnell's voice was steady. "You sent the letter?" Beck nodded. "Didn't want anyone else involved." "Not yet." There was a long silence, broken only by the sound of a car passing in the distance. "You destroyed that warehouse," Darnell said. Beck nodded again. "I knew it was over. Figured if I was going down, I wouldn't go alone." Darnell stepped closer. "Then why are you here?" Beck exhaled slowly. "Because I realized something. Doesn't matter how much you burn. Some truths don't die. You brought that to me. You made me look at things I spent years avoiding." Darnell's jaw clenched. "Don't play confession now. You don't get to rewrite this." Beck turned finally, his eyes dark, tired. "I'm not. I'm just saying, maybe you're right. Maybe this place needs to be gutted. But don't let it turn you into us." Darnell stared at him for a long time, trying to find even a thread of sincerity. He didn't know if it was real. If it was guilt. Or just survival. But it didn't matter. The word stuck. And as Beck walked away, disappearing into the shadows, Darnell stood there, unsure for the first time if victory and justice were ever supposed to feel the same. Because now the question was no longer what he had exposed. But what he was going to do with the power he had gained. The street was still empty when Beck vanished into the dark, and Darnell stood there for a long time, not chasing him, not calling out, just breathing in the heavy, silent weight of the city that had shaped him and now waited for his next move. The meeting hadn't brought closure. It hadn't brought justice. It had brought something far more unsettling, a mirror. Because in Beck's eyes, for just a moment, Darnell had seen the reflection of a man teetering on the edge of a line he'd sworn never to cross. The power to dismantle had come quickly, but the responsibility to rebuild, that was the burden now pressing against his chest like a lead anchor. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat at his dining table with Jamari's photo in front of him and the open file of the whistleblower's statement beside it. The words blurred together, every sentence a memory, every admission a ghost of a life ruined under the shadow of a badge. The more he read, the more he wondered if tearing down the house was the easy part, because now, standing among the ashes, he had to decide what kind of justice he believed in. Was it punishment, or redemption? Was it revenge, or reform? And was he prepared for the answer? The next morning, Nayshaw stormed into his office, eyes wide, voice shaking with a mix of fury and disbelief. She tossed a folder onto his desk, her words spilling fast. "You need to see this. Right now." Darnell opened it, flipping through a series of internal memos, emails, and surveillance reports. They were dated from years ago, well before Beck's team even came into power. Names he hadn't seen before surfaced. Deputies. Commanders. Even members of city council. The pattern stretched back decades. Generations of cover-ups and carefully orchestrated deception. The network was bigger than he thought. Beck and his crew weren't the disease, they were symptoms. And now, staring at this web of complicity, Darnell realized the roots were so deep, justice might not be enough to rip them out. Nayshaw sat across from him, her voice softer now, laced with something she rarely let show, doubt. "You wanted to fix the system, D. But what if there's nothing left to fix? What if the system was built broken from the start?" Darnell looked at her, his fingers resting on the edge of the file. "Then maybe it's not about fixing it. Maybe it's about building something else." She exhaled slowly, unsure whether to be inspired or terrified by his conviction. That afternoon, a city council meeting was held, open to the public. The room was packed. Protesters lined the back walls. Officers watched silently. The mayor sat rigidly at the front, eyes hard and unreadable. Darnell was called to speak, not to testify, not to accuse, but to explain what came next. He stood at the podium, his voice clear but heavy, every word weighed against the knowledge that it would either ignite change or collapse the fragile support he had left. He didn't waste time. He told them about the deeper corruption. The memos. The timeline. The people in power who had benefited from silence while entire communities were torn apart. He didn't name names, not yet. But he made it clear the clock had started ticking. Then he looked around the room, locking eyes with the mayor. This isn't just about bad apples. It's about a garden that was poisoned long before we were born. And we have a choice to make. We can bury what we found and try to move on like none of this happened. Or we can tell the truth. Even if it burns. Even if it breaks us first. Because if we don't, if we let this moment pass, then we become the silence we've spent our lives trying to break. For a moment, no one moved. No clapping. No shouting. Just silence. Then, slowly, people began to rise, quiet at first, then louder, standing, not in protest this time, but in solidarity. The moment was powerful, but Darnell knew better than to confuse emotion with action. Change wouldn't come with applause. It would come in the long, messy, painful road after. Later that week, as the investigation widened, something unexpected happened. A young officer, barely a year into service, requested a private meeting with Darnell. When he arrived, the young man looked nervous, almost ashamed. He handed over a worn notebook filled with dates, locations, and names. Notes he had kept from ride-alongs, overheard conversations, things he had been told to forget. Darnell flipped through it slowly, heart sinking. These weren't just violations. These were rituals. Normalized cruelty. Quiet threats. Coerced silence. The young officer spoke, voice trembling. They told me it was just part of the job. That you learn to look the other way if you want to survive. But I joined to help people. I didn't sign up for this. Darnell looked at him, something cracking in his chest. You didn't. But now that you've seen it, you can't unsee it. So you have to decide, are you ready to stand on the other side? The young man nodded. Not out of certainty, but out of courage. But even as allies emerged, so did resistance. An anonymous online smear campaign began circulating about Darnell. Old photos taken out of context. Half-truths twisted into scandal. Personal messages leaked. Nayshaw slammed the laptop closed after reading one article. They're trying to destroy your name now. That's the last card they've got left. Darnell didn't flinch. Let them play it. My name isn't what built this movement. The truth did. In private meetings, city officials argued over how far to let the investigation go. Some wanted to contain it. Others wanted to use it to elevate their own careers. But Darnell refused to compromise. When one council member suggested a settlement to avoid further public embarrassment, Darnell cut him off, voice sharp. People didn't bleed for a settlement. They bled for change. If you can't see that, step aside. But what haunted Darnell most wasn't the attacks. It was the letters. They kept coming. Anonymous notes. Testimonies. Photos. One envelope had a photo of a boy in a hospital bed, bruised, bandaged, alone. No name. Just a date. Darnell remembered that date. A quiet Tuesday where no one noticed what the city tried to bury. The weight of all these lives, known and unknown, pressed into his soul until it felt like it might crack. And yet, he carried them anyway. Then, one night, Jamari sat across from him for the first time in weeks. The boy had grown quieter, more withdrawn since the trial. But now he looked older, sharper. He looked his uncle in the eye and asked a question that hit harder than any headline. "Are you happy now?" Darnell froze. "What do you mean?" Jamari shrugged, voice low. "You got them. You brought it all down. But you don't smile anymore. You don't rest. It's like, you won, but you're still losing." Darnell leaned forward, the exhaustion leaking into every word. "I didn't do this to be happy. I did this so maybe one day, you could be." Jamari nodded slowly, then whispered, "Just don't forget how to be human in the middle of all this. I don't want to lose you to the same thing you're fighting." That night, Darnell sat alone again, not with files, not with news feeds, but with his thoughts. The city outside was still burning with questions. And somewhere, Beck was still out there, maybe watching, maybe running. But Darnell wasn't chasing him anymore. Because the real fight was no longer about one man. It was about the world he left behind. And now, Darnell had to decide how that world would be rewritten. The days began blending into each other, the passage of time marked not by sunrises or calendars but by revelations and repercussions. Darnell had become the face of a movement he never asked to lead, but now, there was no turning away from it. With every document he uncovered, every confession that landed on his desk, every pair of eyes in the community that looked to him for direction, he understood that this wasn't just about punishment or reformation, it was about identity. About reclaiming what had been stolen from generations, dignity, safety, trust, and most of all, truth. But that truth came with a price. People who once cheered for him were growing restless. The process wasn't fast enough for some. For others, it was too loud, too disruptive. And the more powerful the revelations, the more subtle the threats became. Darnell had learned to live with the tension in his shoulders, the paranoia that whispered when he turned corners or stood alone in a room too long. He didn't let it stop him. But it was always there. One rainy evening, he received a visitor he hadn't expected, an older man in a crisp brown coat, hands weathered, voice smooth but cautious. He introduced himself as Harold Gibbons, a retired officer who had served 3 decades ago, long before Beck ever wore a badge. He looked around Darnell's office as if stepping into a sacred space, his eyes settling on the file cabinets before he finally spoke. "I've been watching you," he said, his voice low, respectful. "From a distance. And I've seen the cost this thing has taken on you." Darnell studied him, uncertain whether to trust the calm in the man's tone. "You didn't come to congratulate me," he said. Gibbons shook his head. "No. I came because I made the same mistake once. I saw things I didn't stop. And I thought staying quiet would protect what little good I believed was left in the department. But silence doesn't protect anything. It just feeds the disease." He handed Darnell a sealed envelope. Inside was a signed affidavit, a list of names, and a map marking storage locations where case evidence had been quietly relocated decades earlier, documents and tapes believed lost or destroyed. "This is the rest of it," Gibbons said. "The part they hoped would stay buried. I didn't speak back then, but I'm speaking now." Darnell didn't thank him. He just nodded, because he knew words weren't enough to repay that kind of confession. Gibbons turned toward the door, pausing only once. "Be careful, son. The deeper you go, the harder it gets to come back." Later that night, Nayshaw came to his place, drenched from the rain, holding a stack of files too sensitive to carry by car. They laid them out on his living room floor, their knees pressed into the carpet, the entire room lit only by the soft glow of the lamp beside them. Each page read like a wound. A complaint ignored. A child handcuffed. A mother silenced. A name crossed out. Nayshaw ran her hand over one folder, eyes glassy. "Do you ever wonder if it'll make a difference?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Darnell stared at a photo of a missing report. "Every damn day. She looked at him, really looked at him, and for a moment neither of them were Chief Whitaker and Chief Investigator, just two people, broken open by the truth they had chosen to carry. The next morning, they brought the files to the Temporary Oversight Board. Cameras flashed. Journalists hovered. And for once, the board didn't resist. They listened. They opened an independent inquiry into the city's evidence handling protocols. For the first time, a full audit of the police department was ordered, not just for the last 5 years, but for the last 30. That victory should have felt bigger. But the celebration was muted. Because that same afternoon, Darnell received an anonymous tip that Beck had been spotted near the state line. Alone. Armed. And angry. Darnell didn't tell the media. He didn't issue a statement. He met with Cruz in private, laying the report on the table. "I don't want a manhunt," he said. "I want a resolution." Cruz frowned. "You're not obligated to go near him again, Darnell. Let the marshals do their job." Darnell leaned forward. "You don't get it. If he's still out there, the story never ends. The people don't get closure. I don't get peace." The next night, Darnell returned to the same alley where they had last spoken. It was quiet again, but this time, he wasn't alone. Beck stepped out of the shadows like he had been waiting. He looked worse. Thinner. Desperate. But his voice carried the same dangerous confidence. "So you found the rest," he said with a slight smirk. Darnell didn't engage the bait. "I found enough. Enough to put you away for life. But that's not why I came." Beck narrowed his eyes. "Then why? To finish what you started? You want a headline?" Darnell's expression didn't change. "No. I want you to turn yourself in. You know what you did. You've known for a long time. And I think a part of you, whatever's left that isn't rotted, knows this doesn't end with you hiding." There was a pause. Beck looked at him for a long time, something shifting in his eyes. A flicker. Maybe of shame. Maybe of surrender. But it passed quickly, replaced by bitterness. "You think this ends with me in cuffs? You think the city changes because of a few files?" Darnell stepped closer, quiet and certain. "No. I think it changes because people like you finally lose their grip. What happened next didn't make the papers. Beck didn't shoot. He didn't run. He walked away, arms raised, and let himself be taken into custody. Quietly. Coldly. As if he knew the weight of the story had already crushed him. The days that followed were strange. The headlines changed from protest to policy. The same council members who had doubted Darnell now invited him to speak. News stations tried to turn him into a celebrity. He declined every offer. Refused every award. Because none of it erased the years lost, the damage done. Justice wasn't a moment, it was a lifetime of undoing what should never have been. But beneath the surface, a dilemma stirred in him. He had the power now to reshape the department. To write new rules. Train new minds. But how do you rebuild trust in something you once fought to destroy? One evening, he sat in his office with Jamari, who watched silently as Darnell drafted new policy frameworks. The boy finally asked, "How do you know you won't become them?" Darnell didn't answer right away. Then, slowly, he said, "I don't. I just know I'll spend every day making sure I don't." And that was the truth. Because justice isn't clean. It's complicated. Exhausting. Necessary. And for the first time in decades, the city was listening. Not just to Darnell, but to itself. To the stories it had buried. To the voices it had silenced. And what they did next, would define what kind of city it was ready to become. Months passed, but the echoes of everything that had happened still moved through the city like a low, steady hum. Courtrooms were no longer places of performance for those in power, they had become battlegrounds for truth. Investigations led to resignations. Indictments followed. Beck faced trial, not as a cop, not as a protector of order, but as a man exposed, unraveling under the weight of evidence and testimony that couldn't be silenced anymore. During the proceedings, he remained mostly silent, avoiding eye contact, shrinking behind lawyers who could no longer spin a story clean enough to protect him. The footage, the testimonies, the archives, they had already spoken louder than he ever could. When the verdict came, guilty on multiple counts of obstruction, assault, and conspiracy, there was no applause. Just a deep, collective exhale across a city long suffocated by silence. For the victims, justice was not a cure, but it was a crack in the armor. And for Darnell, it was proof that persistence could still move mountains when truth was at the helm. Salinger took a plea deal, trading his badge for probation and mandatory public testimony against his fellow officers. He moved out of state shortly after, reportedly trying to start over, though whispers followed him wherever he went. McKnight, the most violent of them all, faced civil suits and lost nearly everything he owned. And yet, not one of them showed true remorse. Redemption, it seemed, wasn't for everyone. But the justice system, for once, had remembered what it was supposed to do, hold power accountable, no matter who wore the uniform. But this story was never about just them. It was about those who stood up. Those who didn't run. Nay Shah, once just a quiet force behind the desk, was now the new director of community justice reform, her face now recognized as one of unwavering fire. She implemented citywide programs that centered on healing and accountability, not just punishment. Schools began inviting her to speak. Youth programs flourished with her guidance. She had become what Darnell always knew she was, more than capable, more than necessary. Jamari, still young but forever changed, returned to school with the kind of purpose that can only come from survival. His voice matured. His posture straightened. He interned at a local policy center over the summer, helping draft legislation inspired by the trauma he never asked to endure. One afternoon, he stood beside Darnell during a citywide public forum and spoke for the first time. "I used to be afraid to walk alone," he said, steady and clear, "but now I know that when we speak, when we fight, we don't walk alone anymore." The crowd didn't just clap, they stood. For him. For what he represented. For a generation no longer asking to be seen, but demanding it. And Darnell, he was no longer interim anything. His appointment became permanent, not just in title but in spirit. He didn't wear his power like armor. He wore it like responsibility. He restructured the department from the inside out. He fired those who needed to go. He promoted voices that had long been ignored. He created independent oversight panels run by civilians. He refused to attend political galas or ribbon cuttings. Instead, he sat in community centers, listened to the people, took notes, and made change happen where it mattered most. When asked by a journalist why he never seemed to rest, he answered with a tired smile, "Because rest is a privilege too many of us never had. I'll rest when the next generation doesn't need to fight like we did." On the one-year anniversary of the court hearing, the city unveiled a new public space in the center of Oakland. A large plaza with a mural that stretched across a brick wall, faces of victims, names of survivors, fists raised in defiance, children smiling in hope. At the base of the mural, etched into stone, was a quote, "Power used in silence is fear. Power used in truth is justice." The quote was attributed to Darnell Whitaker. He didn't ask for it. He didn't even know it was happening. But when he saw it for the first time, standing beside Jamari, he felt something he hadn't felt in years, not victory, not relief, but peace. This wasn't the end of the road, and he knew that. Corruption doesn't die quietly. Racism doesn't evaporate with one trial. But what had begun was a shift, a foundational crack in a long-standing wall. And now, Darnell wasn't the only one pushing. The people were. The system was. And maybe, just maybe, that was the start of something that could finally last. "Now let me ask you something. Have you ever been made to feel small? Powerless? Mocked for simply existing, for speaking up, for daring to challenge something bigger than yourself? Have you ever swallowed your truth because you thought no one would believe you, or worse, because you were afraid of what would happen if they did? If you have, then this story was for you. Not just for the justice that finally came, but for the resistance it took to get there. For the courage it took to stay standing when the world expected you to fall. Darnell's story isn't just fiction, it's a mirror. A reminder that the fight for dignity isn't grand or glamorous. It's painful. It's slow. It's fought in quiet offices, lonely courtrooms, late-night conversations, and the hearts of people who refuse to be broken. It's about choosing, again and again, to believe that truth matters more than comfort. That justice is possible. That silence can be shattered. So now we want to hear from you. What did this story make you feel? Who did you see yourself in? And what are you willing to speak up for, no matter who's laughing? Drop your thoughts in the comments, we read them all. Let's keep the conversation going. And if this story moved you in any way, if it made you angry, hopeful, empowered, or even just curious, don't forget to subscribe to Tales of Twist for more stories that dig deep and don't let go. Hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and join us as we keep telling the stories that others are afraid to tell. We'll see you in the next twist.